Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be here to announce our government's next steps when it comes to Ottawa's carbon tax, alongside Minister of Justice Mickey Amery, Minister of Environment and Protected Areas Rebecca Schultz, Minister of Finance Nate Horner, Minister of Energy and Minerals Brian Jean, and Minister of Affordability and Utilities Nathan Neudorf. It's the end of October, and here in Alberta, the nights are below zero. There's snow up on the mountains, and parents are preparing to zip jackets over their kids' Halloween costumes. In just a few weeks, winter will be upon us. And Alberta winters are no joke. In this province, winter means long nights and freezing temperatures for weeks at a time. I'm sure we all remember the polar vortex that swept through our province this past January, when daily highs remained around minus 30 degrees and lows were around minus 40 degrees, with the wind chill dropping temperatures closer to minus 50. Those temperatures are devastatingly and dangerously cold. Home heating is not optional, and in Alberta, that means we rely on natural gas not just to keep us warm, but to keep us safe. Winter is coming again, and that means that Alberta families will again feel the sting of the federal carbon tax as they heat their homes with natural gas. Here in Alberta, we don't tend to think that more taxes are the solution for anything, let alone a tax on all the things our citizens need to live and thrive in this cold climate. Given the cost of living challenges many households are facing, piling more financial burden onto Canadians is simply cruel and punitive. Until recently, the punishment from Ottawa was shared equally across the country. At the very least, that equal footing gave Canadians a unified front to push back on the federal government, a sense maybe that we were all in it together. But a year ago, almost to the day, Ottawa announced it was exempting heating oil from the federal carbon tax for 3 years. Now, that's great for the people of Atlantic Canada and Quebec, who have a higher proportion of their citizens who use heating oil. But let's be clear, most Albertans don't resent them for it either. Unfortunately, this exemption applies to practically no one outside of Eastern Canada. Added to that, the carbon tax on natural gas is more than triple the cost of natural gas itself. The carbon tax rate is about 4 cents a gigajoule, and gas is selling for $1.25 a gigajoule. Now, we can debate why Ottawa made this decision. We may even have a few theories, but whatever their reasons, the outcome is blatantly unfair for people in Alberta and other parts of Canada who use natural gas and other fuels to stay warm in the winter. From where we're sitting, it looks an awful lot like one more attempt to divide our country, to reward one region and punish another. And we're not going to sit back and let this unfair carve-out disadvantage Albertans for another winter. And so I'm pleased to announce that this morning, Alberta filed an application for a judicial review of the exemption in the federal court. We're asking the court to declare the exemption both unconstitutional and unlawful. We hope that this will force Ottawa to recognize the burden the carbon tax places on Canadians and eliminate the tax altogether. Albertans know we've got their backs on this. Our government has been fighting the federal carbon tax since 2019. We even took it to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2021. It was wrong when it was made into law, and it's wrong now. The federal carbon tax has always been unfair, but the selective way it's being applied now is also unconstitutional. And the impacts on Albertans will only get worse as the costs continue to increase. According to their own communications, the exemption was intended to lower energy bills for people who use heating oil. They're saying, in effect, that some Canadians deserve lower energy bills, but not all. They're also more or less admitting that the federal carbon tax raises costs for households, which confirms what we've been saying about it all along. The carbon tax is driving up the cost of everything. Let's take an example from our education system. Since the carbon tax was first implemented, Alberta school authorities have paid more than $49 million to the federal government without receiving any rebate. By the 2030-2031 school year, we are projecting that they'll pay more than $60 million per year. There's a lot our school authorities could do with that money. They, for instance, could hire 495 teachers with what they'll be sending to Ottawa in 2030. In our healthcare system, we could hire nearly 1,000 nurses by 2030, critical frontline workers, instead of sending that money to Ottawa. Or consider the cost to municipalities. In 2023 alone, the City of Calgary could have hired an additional 112 police officers or firefighters for the amount that they sent to Ottawa for the carbon tax. Or consider the savings in a time when Canadians are coping with levels of inflation that we haven't seen in decades. The carbon tax is adding to inflation. In fact, according to the Bank of Canada, the federal carbon tax increases inflation by 0.15% per year, year over year. But we also know that the impact that taxes have on inflation, because when we paused the collection of our 13-cent per litre provincial fuel tax, we saw inflation slow in our province. We've seen the same thing in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Imagine the impact on inflation if we removed 3 times that amount in 2030. The carbon tax on fuel will reach 39.6 cents per litre. According to the Canadian Energy Centre, the carbon tax will account for 24% of annual fuel costs. Imagine the savings to Canadians if their bill was a quarter the cost when they filled up. If the federal government is now saying that removing the carbon tax on home heating oil will lower costs, then this carbon tax exemption for Eastern Canada blows a big hole in their justification for the carbon tax. Furthermore, applying it unequally is unconstitutional, and it runs counter to Ottawa's own carbon tax legislation. Our end goal is the same as a growing number of Canadians from across the country: to get rid of the retail carbon tax. If Ottawa won't axe this heartless tax altogether, they can at least play fair when imposing it on Canadians, and that's what we'll be heading back to court to achieve. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Minister Mickey Amery to share more.
Well, thank you very much, Premier. This morning, as the Premier mentioned, Alberta filed an application for judicial review in federal court. The federal government continues to act outside the law, and they need to be held accountable. Alberta has stepped up to do just that. The federal government's carbon tax exemption for heating oil is both unconstitutional and unlawful. Unconstitutional, as it applies what is supposed to be a national standard unfairly and inconsistently across the country to benefit one particular region. In this case, those who use home heating oil, which is more emissions intensive than most other heating fuels, receive an economic benefit that is not provided to those who heat their homes in different ways. Unlawful, because the federal government's actions are also inconsistent with their stated purpose for enacting the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act in the first place. The purpose of this legislation was supposedly to set a minimum national standard for carbon pricing to meet emissions targets under the Paris Agreement. This legislation does not give the federal government the authority to make special exemptions for certain regions of our country. Inconsistently applying federal law to score political points is not something that we should ignore. On a number of fronts, we continue to encourage the federal government to stay within their jurisdiction. A cooperative relationship where Alberta is consulted on matters that concern us, and a relationship where provincial jurisdiction is respected would, of course, be what is the ideal scenario. In the absence of that, however, we need to assert our jurisdiction and protect the rights of Albertans through the courts. Through this application for judicial review, we're asking the federal court to declare the heating oil exemption unconstitutional and unlawful. Of course, the federal government needs to completely remove the carbon tax. However, until they do, the carbon tax needs to be fairly and consistently applied across the country. The federal government can't ignore their own laws or the Constitution for political gain. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Minister. We have a few minutes to take some questions from the media. Just a reminder, it'll be one question, one follow-up. Please state your name and outlet for the record. We will start here in the room, then we'll go to the phones. Catherine?
Yeah, Catherine Krakowski, Alberta Today. So you had previously talked about perhaps reopening the challenge against the carbon tax itself, but it sounds like this judicial application applies only to the exemption. Can you explain kind of why you went that?
Yeah, most certainly. When the federal government announced the heating exemption for heating oil and not for other areas of of the country that predominantly use different types of heating to heat their homes, the idea was that they created a distinct class of people, of beneficiaries that were exempt from the carbon tax, which we think is unconstitutional. It's inappropriate to grant exemptions to one region of the country while unfairly treating others in other regions of the country differently. Here in Alberta, we use natural gas, but that does not fall within the exemptions, and predominantly a number of other provinces use it as well. In the case of this exemption, it does not apply or impact Alberta in any significant way, and we think that's unconstitutional and quite frankly unfair.
And maybe more of a question for the Premier, but David He was re-elected, Scott Moe was re-elected. Have you had any discussions with them about joining in this fight?
I've sent text to both Premier Eby as well as Premier Moe congratulating them on returning to office. I told Premier Eby I'm looking forward to working with him collaboratively on some of the energy files that we've been talking about together, building out the hydrogen economy, exporting ammonia, getting more export capacity for LNG. And I spoke with Premier Moe about potentially considering joining this case. So we'll see what I mean, he's already demonstrated that he believes that the federal government is treating his province unfairly. He acted in a bit of a different way than we did, and I hope that he's able to join this case as soon as he gets his cabinet sworn in.
Shaylin?
Yeah, just wondering what the motivation for why making this announcement now. The exemption on home heating oil has been in place for a year, I believe.
Well, it takes a little bit of time for us to get our legal arguments developed. It's a timing thing. It's the work that needs to happen internally with the Justice Department. The Justice team that is leading this is phenomenal. It is being handled in-house within our department, and we just needed the time to develop our legal arguments and prepare for the legal challenge.
I guess some might say if you're standing up for Albertans, did it take a year to launch that legal argument, especially since you have launched several legal cases against the federal government stepping out of its jurisdiction before?
Most certainly, but we take the time to get this right. We've been tremendously successful in a number of different areas in the past year and even before that as well. In a number of different areas, as you recall, the Emergencies Act was deemed to be unconstitutional. We know that the plastics ban was struck down by the courts as well. C-69, most recently by the Supreme Court of Canada, was deemed largely unconstitutional as well. And so for those reasons, I think that we're well equipped and well prepared, but we will take the time to do it right and serve Albertans best.
Sorry, Premier, this holiday for heating oil is not just aimed at Eastern Canada, it's the whole country. Now, you could say we don't use a lot here in Alberta, but it's not as if they're said only the Maritimes or Atlantic Canada gets a holiday. It's the entire country, except the provinces, I guess, that have their own carbon tax. Like BC.
So less than 1% of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba use home heating oil. It's 1% in British Columbia. It's 2% in Ontario, 4% in Quebec, 7% in New Brunswick, 18% in Newfoundland and Labrador, 32% in Nova Scotia, 40% in Prince Edward Island. I think it's pretty clear that there are certain regions in the country that are disproportionately benefiting from this. The entire argument that the federal government made about why they needed to impose a federal retail carbon tax was to create fairness across the country. This clearly does not create fairness, and it in fact exempts one of the highest emitting fuels. So they've undermined their entire argument. And if their argument is that it's an affordability issue, well, it's an affordability issue for us too. So we think that they've opened themselves up to a challenge on it.
Speaking of money and affordability, a different topic, but related to money. I've heard that during your recent caucus retreat that MLAs were told we could be heading towards a deficit in Alberta. Is that true?
Well, look, it's a serious problem. My finance minister warned of that when we launched our budget this year, that we need $74 oil to average throughout the year in order to run a $300 million surplus. If you look at the prices, they went down below $67 yesterday, and so we're watching that very closely. But when you look at some of the projections coming in from the different forecasters, they're projecting potentially that oil will come down to $65 in future years. So we want to be honest with people that, yeah, we've had some really good years. And when we have really good years, we've generated windfall revenue, and we've been responsible with them. We've made sure that the lion's share of them go into paying down debt or going into savings. But I think people need to understand that we want to be able to run balanced budgets, and that's part of we have a number of different pressures coming our way, and we have to be honest with people about what we're facing.
Could the minister respond as well to that? Looking at the deficit.
Well, it's too early to say, Graham. We're just getting into our sincere budget deliberations this fall. We look at the price of oil, we look at the forecasts, but everything the Premier said is correct. It'll be a sincere challenge if there isn't an uplift in the overall forecast for oil, coupled with our population growth pressures that we're seeing on the spending side. So too early to say, but we're watching it every day, and it will be a challenge regardless.
Great, thanks. Jonathan?
Hi, Jonathan Bradley, Western Standard. So you spoke about filing the application to the Federal Court of Canada against the home heating oil exemption. What will be your legal strategy to win the case?
Well, I think it's to identify that there are two key deficiencies here. Number one, that the case is unlawful, as I mentioned earlier, and the fact that it's unconstitutional. It creates a distinction. It divides this country in ways that are unprecedented for this particular federal government. And we just want to make it absolutely clear that Alberta is not being treated fairly in this. You've heard the stats from the Premier. Less than 1% in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba actually use home heating oil, and that creates a disproportionate advantage for people in Eastern Canada. We know that we have our theories about why that is, but certainly we think that it's unconstitutional and it's unlawful. It doesn't comply with the agreements that Canada has entered into. It creates distinctions and a division in this country, and I think that's where our strategy will lie.
Okay. You spoke about how not many Albertans use home heating oil. You mentioned it yourself. It was 1%. Pardon?
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%. So what's stopping the Alberta government from trying to shift towards having more people use home heating oil?
Well, I mean, I'll take a quick stab at this, and I'll let the Premier articulate on it. But we have an abundance of natural gas in this province. It is clean energy. It is available widely all across this province, and indeed, I think it's far better to use more conscience than home heating oil would be. And you would think that the federal government would reward that type of use by providing this exemption to Albertans and to Western Canada. But unfortunately, that's not the case here. We know that natural gas burns cleaner, it's more efficient, it's more environmentally conscious, and yet it's not being recognized in any way. So I'll leave it at that and let the Premier articulate if you wish.
That's fine.
Okay, Emmanuel?
Yeah, I want to understand your legal argument, because the Constitution doesn't say that the federal government can't do a policy for a part of the country and not for another part of the country.
Well, look, at the end, here, let me just give you this for a sec. We are of the opinion that it creates both an unfair and an unequal regional standard benefit to Atlantic Canadians. And we know that rather than creating a minimum standard of greenhouse gas price stringency on heating fuels, it does exactly that. So that will be our constitutional angle. Going further than that as well, we think it's also unlawful. And for the reason that we talked about, it doesn't meet the needs as articulated in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act as well. So we will be approaching this from two different ways, and we think we'll be successful.
And at first, when the home heating oil exemption was announced, you called Premier Spit for an exemption added on also on natural gas. Mm-hmm. What are you calling for now? An exemption, another exemption to make it more equal, or no exemption at all?
We're calling for them to repeal the carbon tax. We've been calling for that for years. The retail carbon tax is just punitive to taxpayers. It's punitive to consumers. In this province, you need gasoline and diesel to get around. In this province, you need natural gas to heat. The lion's share of our electricity comes from natural gas. And we believe that reducing emissions comes from technology, and reducing emissions comes from exporting our cleaner burning fuels internationally. So, yeah, we're hoping that this exemption will be struck down, and that the federal response will be to eliminate the retail carbon tax altogether.
Okay, we have time for one more in the room. Morgan, you want to go ahead?
I'm wondering if you took another stab at direct conversation with the federal government before you decided to take it to court. Like, did you let them know this was
kind of the next step, or did you try, again, in a face-to-face chat with the Minister of Environment?
I've made my position pretty clear to the federal government about how I feel about this tax and all of their intrusions into provincial jurisdiction when it comes to emissions caps, when it comes to trying to regulate a net zero power grid. I'm sure they won't be surprised by this.
But no conversations?
No conversations on this, but we've been letting them know for some time, for many years, that we're not happy with the approach that they're taking.
And for the Justice Minister, courts take a long time. What do you expect to be the timeline? I mean, Ottawa is pushing forward the 2025 goal of emission reduction in general, so.
Well, we anticipate that this legal challenge will take approximately 12 months. We're looking forward to moving as quickly as possible, obviously. The question earlier about the timing and how long it took is an important question, but I think it's important to highlight that we've been very successful in this province when it's come to both constitutional and jurisdictional challenges against the federal government, and the same legal teams are leading this as well, and I think that they're doing a tremendous job, so we have tremendous faith in their ability to be successful in this one as well.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're gonna go to the phones and take a few on the line. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
Your first question comes from the line of Kian Bexley from the Counter Signal. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is for the Premier Kian Bexley with the Counter Signal. Natural gas is by far the cleanest fossil fuel that you can burn, and I think that the feds know this. They know that home heating oil is a dirty way to heat homes, yet they gave it the exemption. So I'm curious if you know what their argument is going to be. They can't go to the judge and cry about how they were going to lose seats out east, so they needed to do this. What are they going to say why they needed to do this?
Well, I think you've offered one political reason why they might have chosen to do it. I have no idea what the legal or technical reason they would argue for why they would do this. I would certainly hope that they wouldn't be playing politics with something as important as home heating in the middle of winter in Canada. But the fact of the matter is they have brought forward an exemption that violates their own law and we believe violates the Constitution. And I guess we'll see if the courts agree.
Just to follow up, it's slightly different, but the Bloc just announced today that they will be hoping to bring down the Trudeau government. Would you prefer that this all be for nothing and that the government falls and this gets repealed by a different government?
Look, I've said that I don't believe that Justin Trudeau has a mandate to impose the kind of policies that he is talking about, particularly with the emissions cap. It's why we started the Scrap the Cap campaign, particularly with the net zero power regulations. We are worried that the approach that they're taking is one where they clearly have an agenda to keep it in the ground. By having such aggressive emissions reduction targets by 2030 would shut in, so S&P Global says, 1 million barrels of production. By 2035, 2.1 million barrels of production. We don't think that they have the authority to do that. They have consistently gone down in the polls over the last year. They no longer have a coalition government with the NDP. And this is one of the most significant aspects of our GDP, potential to lose 150,000 jobs, potential to cost not only our government, but their government significant revenues. So when you have something of this importance, he should seek a mandate to be able to do this. And that's why we would be quite happy to see an election called sooner rather than later. If he gets a mandate, then I guess we deal with it through the courts afterwards. If he doesn't get a mandate, then hopefully we'll be able to have a constructive conversation with the next government.
Thanks, Premier. We have time for a couple more questions. Operator, next caller, please.
Your next question comes from the line of Jason Martesal from C. Please go ahead.
Premier, question with regards to rights statutes. Do you intend, or does the government intend to apply the notwithstanding clause on any of the legislation it will table on transgender issues?
We're trying to find the right balance. We've already indicated in our policy, our Bill of Rights, that parents have the right to determine the education for their kids. So we think that the court will be mindful of that as we're bringing through some of the notification provisions in the Education Act. And I think it's been pretty clearly, I think, established in law that young children do not have the mental capacity to make their healthcare decisions until they become of an age of maturity. So we think that that is likely to be compliant with the law as well. And we also are we have also heard that women and girls need protection in their ability to participate in sport. And so we're not anticipating having to use a notwithstanding clause. We think we found a reasonable balance.
Thank you very much for that answer. Question for Minister Horner. I believe it was several months ago, you were on national television saying you were absolutely serious that you wanted to bring in a incentive program to encourage Albertans to get home heating oil. If you were indeed absolutely serious about it, what happened to that investigation?
Well, I think I said I was deadly serious, but I was deadly serious about making a point, and I think I did. As the Premier and the Minister have said, you know, Alberta uses natural gas. It's a cleaner burning fuel. If the market signals from the federal government want to push people towards using diesel and heating fuel to heat their homes, that's ridiculous. So that's the point I was making. But yeah, we don't make policy decisions in the middle of interviews.
Great, thanks. Operator, we have time for one more question, so please put through the next caller.
Your next question comes from the line of Don from Calgary Herald. Please go ahead.
Premier, could I ask you, given your recent comments about the promised income tax reduction, that it would not happen in 2027, but would be pulled forward a bit, and I guess we're assuming or hoping it will be in 2025 budget next spring. Now, what happens, though, if oil does hit these lower levels that you're so concerned about? Are you still going to go ahead with that tax break a little sooner, as you said? That is next year?
We are doing what we can to accelerate the tax cut. We're looking at all of the factors. As you know, there's a Treasury Board process that starts pretty soon here, through the months of November and December, and then we'll release the budget in February. We are looking to find a way to accelerate that tax cut, but we'll have to do our work over the next few months to see if we can do that.
Could I follow by asking, do you plan to phase it? That is, bring it in by degrees rather than all at once?
Again, that would be another aspect that they'd be discussing at Treasury Board. I mean, I take my finance minister's advice seriously, and so he will give us guidance once he's gone through the Treasury Board proposals, had a chance to assess what the asks of the ministries are, assessed all of the different pressures that we're having, looking at where we find ourselves with resource royalties. There's a lot of factors to consider, so it does take a number of months to get to it, but I'll certainly be taking my finance minister's advice on that.
Great, thanks everyone. That concludes our press conference for today.
Thanks,
Have a good day. See ya.